Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. My name is Penny Colpin. In this segment, I want to compare concrete and abstract. Sounds pretty basic for, a lot of people. But in what I've looked at, there's a relationship there, and then some people kind of get confused as to where to focus. So concrete, by that I mean kind of the physical world, the physicality of it. This desk, a door, a house, a cat, or whatever, right? But when you get into experiences like mine, it actually has more to do with abstract elements. And those are the things that can't be seen. They don't show up on x-rays. They can't be measured a lot of the time. You're reliant on subjective type data rather than objective, which usually objective would be the stuff you can measure, the stuff you can count. So some of the abstract elements that come into play are things like mind, psyche, consciousness, shadow, that type of thing, even possibly emotion. You can maybe measure a response, some kind of biochemical thing related to emotion. But that doesn't capture the actual feeling in the nervous system, the impact to the energy of the person involved, which is more on the abstract side. So when we look at things of mental health or mental issues, that's more related, in my opinion, to the mind, not the brain, which is the physical organ. And so in the biomedical model, there's this theory that these mental issues are caused by or created by biochemical imbalances in the physical, in the brain, as opposed to something happening in that mental world. I think that the mental world captures more of the creativity. It captures imagery, imagination. It structures your experiences. It's some kind of repository, or it has access to past experiences and relationships and how things are related to each other. And of course, on the brain side, you have all these neurons, and it's a very complicated organ, for sure. But that doesn't mean that's the source of everything. Having been through the journey I've been through, the problem was more on the abstract side. And that is part of why the title for my book, Musings from a Kinsakuried Mind. Not a kinsakuried brain. My brain didn't literally fracture and explode and collapse, but segments of my mind. That's a good way to describe it. So it was more of that abstract element than the physical. Now, is there a relationship between the two? Well, certainly. I mean, what I see and how I store and how I feel is definitely related to this physical world around me. But that doesn't mean we should ignore the abstract elements of it. Now, maybe someday we'll be able to measure more of that. We'll be able to, I don't know, see, like shadow, ego. At this point, those are concepts. Ego doesn't show up on an x-ray. Psyche doesn't show up on an x-ray. And yet, in my experiences, that's what I found to be useful in terms of terminology. So one way I look at it is back in March of this year, I was helping my brother move back to Montana, and I was supposed to drive one of his trucks back from where he was living in Wyoming. The morning I left, I went to step up on the running board to get in the truck. My foot slipped. It was wet. It was above freezing by a few degrees, but it may have iced or whatever. But anyway, my foot slipped. All the weight that I put on that foot fell like, 2 feet or whatever onto the ground. Ended up slamming into the door. Have a lovely scar now where I got a wound here, required a few stitches. And the thoughts were that I had a concussion. As it turned out, I actually had something called BPPV, which I forget what the name of that is, but it was basically a crystal out of the inner ear that got pushed off into one of the tubes, and which is not where it's supposed to be. But that night, of course, I wasn't in a position where I could drive, So instead, we left one of the trucks there. My brother brought me back to Montana and then had to turn around and go back and get the other truck with the neighbor. The thing is that evening, I did okay in the ER, the emergency room. They had me laying, back a little bit. I actually, when it first happened, I was able to get up to his apartment where the main entry is on the second story. And then I went to lay down, and then I just couldn't get my bearings. Okay. So, given a fall like that, it seems like, yeah, there was definitely some physical injury or something that happened, either when I slammed into the door, part of, my brain, a traumatic brain injury. A mild form of that is a concussion. Um, something physical happened, and that affected my behavior. That affected how I functioned in this world, how I perceived things. As I laid on the floor, because we had packed up all the stuff out of his apartment, if I turned my head to the side, I just had no bearing. It was really uncomfortable. And so my state of consciousness, you could say, was affected by what happened in the physical world. If I would consider consciousness to be more abstract, clearly something happened in the physical world that affected some of these abstract things. Okay. As it turned out, that evening when we got back to Montana, for the first time ever in my life, when I went to lay down, I went from sitting on the couch to laying down. As I transitioned, I'd never had a room spin before. Okay, so again, that is, caused apparently by something that happened physically in my brain, or in the case of my ear with this crystal, that affected the whole way I perceived the room around me in terms of spinning. So what happens if something happens in the abstract elements, the psyche, the shadow, the ego, um, in how that part functions? Could that affect the physical? Could that affect how a person behaves in the physical? Quite possibly. But if you only look for the cause in the physical, you're probably not going to deal with the real issue, which is in that more abstract area. So that's why, for me, it's like, look, you don't just get to dismiss the abstract components just because they're inconvenient to work with, just because you can't measure them, scientifically. However, science, when it comes to statistics, you have both experimental design, where you design treatments and run, I consider it kind of the sexy type of statistics, right? Well, if you're dealing with factors that you can't randomly assign, you're left with something called observational study, where you are reliant on getting information from the people who experience something based on whatever factors and combinations you can't control. But you can at least capture data that way. Well, that's more in line with what I wish had happened with me, is recognizing, hey, something happened in this abstract, some of these abstract elements. Was it my mind? Was it my psyche? Was it my ego? Was it my shadow? Again, because those don't show up, it's hard to pinpoint that, but that doesn't mean those aren't the areas that should be focused on, as opposed to trying to balance out the biochemistry of the brain. And in fact, I remember back in ninth grade, we learned a little bit about logic. So it's like, if P, then Q. Okay, so if there's a problem in the abstract world, if that's the P, if there's a problem in the abstract world, then there's an impact to how that person behaves in the physical world. That doesn't mean by addressing the behavior in the physical world, you've done anything to help what really happened in the abstract world. So in other words, in the logic terms, I'm getting nerdy, I know. If P, then Q does not mean if Q, then P. It means if not Q, then not P. So that's part of the problem as I see it, is that if there's an issue in this abstract area, And that has an effect on how that person behaves and functions in this physical world. Just getting them to behave in this physical world doesn't necessarily deal with whatever's going on in the abstract. If there's an injury in the abstract, it's probably still there and needs to be dealt with. That seems to apply for my type of experience. And I think that's a considerable reason why people get accused of rejecting treatment, is because there's something going on in that structure, in that abstract, in how they formulated their model of the world, or what have you. And that can be much more difficult to deal with. I mean, in a sense, you're flying blind as an outsider to that abstract world. And in fact, my mom, I like the phrase walked on. she walked on in 2019, but she said for several years, she would make the statement, we live in our minds, not that we live in our brains, which definitely the brain has something to do with it, but we live in our minds, our memories, those memories and how they, cause feelings and responses, how we take meaning out of the world around us and events that happen, okay? So we live in our minds, not necessarily our brains. So last year, I was still trying to figure out how to capture some of this material. And so I actually went through and created a bunch of slides. I was trying to differentiate, what's the difference between the mind and the ego and the psyche? How can we get our arms around those abstract concepts? Went through and I looked up a bunch of different definitions and and I had all these slides put together. I was thinking, oh, I could record this. And as I was preparing to, I looked through this and I said, boy, that is the driest thing you've ever created. And I never did record it. I was just like, oh my, this is not it. But I was out at a coffee shop reviewing this, and but as I went through at the end, I had a story I was going to share, and it involved my mom and her saying, "We live in our minds." Well, I think I've mentioned in other videos that she tended to read some of this mystical stuff. She passed it along to me, not necessarily the books she read, but the concepts she took from it. And as I sat there reflecting on my journey, on how a number of concepts or ideas that she shared with me over the years, how they actually helped me, even though she didn't necessarily understand my experience, I thought, Mom, you little seed planter, you, that she planted a bunch of seeds in me, and they took hold enough that I was able to grasp them and use them in a beneficial way. So I was thinking about that, and I packed up my laptop and my book bag, and I was just reflecting on that and thinking, boy, Mom, thanks for planting so many seeds. Before I left the coffee shop, I decided to use the restroom. And when I came out, I should say there were a number of people in there, several conversations. I wouldn't say it was loud, but there was kind of a din in the coffee shop, and I could barely hear the music over the sound system. But as I came out, I recognized the chords right away. And they were from the Beatles song, Let It Be. Now, to most people, that's not significant, but that's the song my mom wanted played at her memorial service. And we did play that at her memorial service. We did the picture montage to it. And so having just thought that about how we live in our minds, and then just a couple minutes later, as I came back out, that song was playing. That's a special memory for me. And again, that's in the abstract. Is that stored somewhere specific in my brain? I don't know, and I don't care, because that is more on what some call the astral plane or what have you. So I share that just for consideration, because as I move forward in sharing concepts, those more abstract concepts, relating them to my experience helped me quite a bit. So just wanted to have that as a little bit of a foundational element so that as we move forward and can build on that, to me, it was something worth talking about and sharing. So I don't know, for people who have these types of experiences, if you know someone and, you're convinced that this is biological in nature, maybe just take a step back and think about what is their life, what is in their mind, the different experiences, how it's stored, how it's accessed, that type of thing. So just wanted to share that. Thanks for joining me. Yeah, and as I've said before, if you like what I'm doing, feel free to share, like, subscribe, all that stuff. But I do hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.